In a democracy, the freedom to say something against someone is beautiful because it allows that individual to get accountability or to demand that person an explanation and all those beautiful things. But then again, this is an assessment on the manner of exercising that democratic principle and how that breeds certain culture in terms of the advancement of the promise of democracy. We think coming from open government, we wanted to frown upon the strategies and the manner of certain politicians or certain political parties in using certain issues that may or may not be related to certain political agendas, but nonetheless are used to taint certain image or to deviate specific focus on certain important discussion. That is the debate. What we wanted to argue in this debate is that on how do we revolutionize the style of politicking status quo. We are against the usage or the malicious or in bad faith usage of tragedies or mistakes that are beyond the will of certain administration, that are no longer healthy or no longer fair in the political maturity of voters, on how politicians look at their agendas or strategies. We think this culture must stop. This isn't healthy. There is another avenue for you to create that discourse without necessarily sensationalizing or creating this unhealthy culture. So what is their concession? The first clarification that they must concede coming from us is that we're not saying that any mistake or violation must not be brought to the public. What we're saying is that it must be subject to a specific standard of inquiry and liability that are bounded by certain credibility or rule of evidence, such as trial, such as legislative inquiry, on all those stuff. So for example, if there is a tragedy such as SAF, what we wanted to say is that we don't want any political party to use as an agenda or campaign to advance their political party. If they don't like that tragedy, they could use that or they could demand, for example, they can demand trial, for example, or inquiry towards that on proper venue. They should not raise that on their political agenda, such as campaign. So we're not against you reporting it to media. We're not against you calling for accountability for rally. What we are against is you using this fact as a matter of advancing yourself in terms of winning the support of the people. Like, for example, of how Noynoy Aquino won the seat. He tried to characterize the Gloria administration as if that it was as bad as it was, and that it was not, that he did not have any liability in his administration. So everything that he did, for example, there is something wrong, he shifted to the Gloria. So that is the kind of culture that is created under this level. So what is the implication then of our assessment? We are willing to create certain policies. So it's not a policy debate, that's the first disclaimer. But the implication of our regret is that first, we will no longer have we will have laws such as anti-black propaganda, or maybe when someone uses this as an agenda, we can have a cause of action as a politician or as an administrator to make that individual go to court and prove whether or not that is true or not. The same on how we try to approach libel. Assuming that it is true, obviously that person will be absolved, but he will still have a liability in terms of violating anti-black propaganda. But then again, if he is not true, or he used that in bad faith, and that was proven, he will be accountable. That is the implication of what do we mean by regret against a policy debate. So I'll be arguing two things into my speech. The first is, why the utilization have created an uncritical mass in terms of shifting or focusing to certain necessary discussion that is blinded or that is shadowed by this kind of sensationalism or opportunity coming from this style of politicking. The second is on how these tragedies, like specific examples such as Loya, Yolanda, or certain things such as South are utilized, or the grief are utilized and disrespected by this politician to advance, and why that is morally wrong and unforgivable. So first, let's argue why we are against the utilization, ladies and gentlemen. Again, let's try to look at the manner in terms of the discussion that it is created. Again, there is no accountability. Binay can just say anything that is bad and can always blame the government for anything that is wrong that happened, even if he has no proof, even if he has that he has also has a role in creating that problem. It's not backed up with evidence. As long as he can say that this should be blamed, what it does, ladies and gentlemen, is that it creates an idea or an automatic judgment that this mistake is attributable to certain person or to certain political party. Why is that harmful? The first is because it's a right that is abused. It's a right, ladies and gentlemen, that is not exercised properly, and we do not have any control or any mechanism to make them accountable or to ensure that when they do this in good faith. So more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we raise the examples such as Yolanda. There are people who died. This is a fortuitous event. We could have not prevented this. But certain political groups or certain political individuals have utilized this grief and have utilized this unfortunate circumstance and blamed the Aquino government that it is as if that it is their fault, even if they too have a liability on it. So more importantly, what does it do to the people? What it do, ladies and gentlemen, to the people is that it does not lead them to discussion. It does not lead them to asking for accountability. What it does is that it creates an automatic judgment that this person or this administration is bad. It destroys or prevents them for political mobility or for political cooperation in future good things that are legislated. Such as, for example, even if Aquino, for example, have supported the Bangsamoro, certain individuals will no longer support that just because he was the one who wanted to fight for this. Because he said, well, Aquino has no legitimacy, he is someone to be blamed for all the mistakes. These are real things, ladies and gentlemen, that is even happening at the end of the day. So there is a culture of mudslinging, and this fact, or this politicking, ladies and gentlemen, allows that to happen. Like, for example, Binay has liabilities as well. And our policy, if there are questions, we don't want the administration to use that in their campaign. They can subject him to trial. But under this model, you even allow certain liable individuals to escape. He can always create certain issues or political agendas that will deviate, ladies and gentlemen, the attention towards him. This is what Binay did. Right now, no one no longer talks about his ill-gotten wealth, because now he could shift the problem towards the Aquino government by using this political problem. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, why is this morally wrong? This is morally wrong because these individuals are people. They have names. They did not consent, ladies and gentlemen, for your political agenda. They did not consent their suffering, ladies and gentlemen, for you to advance in their vote. But you have used that, you have utilized that because you think you should win the vote. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is an assessment debate on how they utilize this trend. We think this is unhealthy. This is not a good critical discourse. This must be stopped.
We thank the Prime Minister, and we now welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
This debate should not just look about the negative side of politicking just because we try to question the motivation or the motive, basically, or of these individuals or the politicians. But we need to recognize and extend the context of this debate when in times of tragedies, especially when we have victims who have irreversible effects to them, how essentially do we have partisan politicking become a legitimate tactic to be able to respond and to be able to extend the help to these victims, especially when these individuals have politicking as their only incentive for them to be able to respond and to be able to help to these particular victims. And that's precisely why we cannot just be able to think that every tragedy is about being able to pass the blame on someone else, but sometimes it's about being able to help people as well. But before that, I want to respond to the previous speaker. But first is their idea about they want to be able to revolutionize the manner of helping in the status quo. And that sometimes we don't have a direct accountability because we create an uncritical mass and that people are truly unaware about certain things. Number one, this is perfectly untrue. Because if you look at it, in the status quo, we have a self-correcting society and a check and balance mechanism, especially when the issue becomes a national spotlight. Because if you look at it, when the issue becomes in the spotlight, basically a lot of sectors in society and a lot of people will try to verify the information and will try to extend the veracity, later sit down, of that particular accountability. So we don't think that people are easily going to absorb every information that you try to feed society or that you try to feed the public. The point is that we will always have discourse in the status quo because people, or we have the academic institutions or academic community who are naturally vibrant and will always be able to forward a counter narrative to all the things that you are talking about. Later, sit down. But then again, there's this idea that they want to fix an uncritical mass of voters because sometimes they think that we are, destroying or tainting the people's minds when it comes to elections. Number one, this is on the assumption that people never really evaluate their politicians in the first place, or they just evaluate based on a recent event. If you look at it, it might be true, but to some extent, we will always have more incentive for more sectors to be able to counter a particular narrative, especially when they find it questionable, especially when we know that that politicking tactic is one that is obvious in the first place. So if you look at it, we think that it's always about the greater priority, the greater urgency when we talk about tragedies and especially the victims who are in the picture. Go on.
You're not debating in the worst case scenario where the debate exists. But if you argue that everyone is responsible, why do we need to go to your model if we can go to court, we can discuss it in perfect avenues?
That's inconsistent with your side because if you say that we have courts anyway to be able to verify information, then obviously all the harms that you are presenting are unlikely to occur. That's why let's talk about two arguments in my speech. The first one is why is this partisan politicking basically legitimate? Because if you look at it, let's try to frame this debate in the context of tragedies and in the context when there are victims that need the help of these politicians. We're talking about instances when the victims of Yolanda died, or where there are a lot of victims in the Yolanda disaster. We have a lot of goods, for example, with rubber stamps and with the stamps, for example, or the stickers of politicians trying to brand out their name. And it's not just about trying to advertise themselves, but sometimes it's a way for them to clean their names in the event of a tragedy. If you look at it, this is a legitimate political tactic because number one, we think that it's a natural humanitarian instinct for us to be able not only to clean our names, but to also to make sure that we are a society who always wants to be recognized, who always wants to be acknowledged, and who always wants to be accepted by society based on moral high ground. So we think that if at the expense of all of these harms that OG is presenting is a tangible benefit to the victims, such as them collecting more goods, for example, or collecting more plastic bags for the victims, even if at the expense of having more stickers of politicians, we think that's perfectly fine in principle, especially when it's humanitarian's nature to never really just give out something at the expense of something else. So we think that if you look at it, given the fact that these individuals or the politicians will always use this as an incentive to be able to extend their help and to at least be able to have another shift of priority is exactly the same thing. Sure, we're not automatically saying that they are not guilty, but the point is that when these individuals try to do something in the event of a disaster to be able to extend help to people, we think that's an unquestionable benefit and a benefit that you cannot deny even if there is an opportunity cost of politicking, which is basically just a secondary issue in times of tragedies. But let's talk about the second extension. Let's analyze a world or a different world where you don't have partisan politicking, and how will politicians basically or people respond to these particular tragedies. We need to recognize that in times of tragedies, it's not just, rich corporations or institutions who try to donate. It's also about these politicians or political parties and all those things. Because if you look at it, relying on the sheer benevolence of people to be able to help in times of tragedies is a very huge gamble. So we think that we have to be able to recognize that in times of these kinds of tragedies, we think that we can be able to rely to this partisan politicking, especially when it can be a legitimate and a tangible way for them to persuade society, to persuade people that I am not perfect maybe, but at least I'm doing something to compensate for the things that I've done, and maybe I have to do something for me to be able to tangibly help and be able to compensate all the things that we are doing. We are not saying that they should not be punished or that these kinds of individuals should not be sent to trial and all those things. But in times of these tragedies, we think that at the expense of a greater value or a greater priority, we think that we have to understand the context and the timing of this partisan politicking. They don't do it out of isolation, out of nowhere, out of the blue. They do it in times when they can be able to use that situation and to exploit the advantage to be able to forward that tangible good to society. So we think that it's already out of hand to be able to question the motives of these individuals. We think that the greater priority is how we're able to respond and how we're able to extend our help even at the expense of always advertising our names, not only because this is a humanitarian interest or a human nature to clean ourselves, to clean our names, but also to be accepted by society, but precisely because in times of tragedies, there is a greater priority in terms of helping. Thanks.
Thank you, Leader of Op. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
The true measure of one's greatness is not when you're able to prove that you're better than the person that came before you, but when you're able to prove that you're better than yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have from opposition is a mechanism that hijacks people's suffering as a platform that denies these victims of their grief and injustice by highlighting that the issue is taken away from the victims but towards the self-aggrandizement of these politicians. In the immediate effect, it's not about the victims and their suffering, but it's about how I'm able to prove that the administration or the opposition is insufficient, does not have the capacity to deal with these problems. But in the long term, we think that people that demands for justice are not able to get them. Because this demand for justice only becomes relevant if it can be used by these politicians for their advantage. Let me try to look at some examples. Like the plight of the Luma, the SAF 44, Bangsamoro Bill, RH Bill. While these are legitimate electoral agenda, it's not an accident that the only time we really invest on talking about them in all media platforms is during the election. Because they are not recognized as valid issues that have direct and concrete impact to the lives of indigenous community, the family of SAF 44, our Muslim brothers and sisters, women, but we see them, or we see these things as exciting spectacles that will attract people's attention, redirect it from the issue at hand to how bad the administration or the opposition is managing these situations. The first effect of this, Mr. Speaker, in the level of principle, is that the government betrays the citizens. Democracy is about a government for the people, by the people, and of the people. What you have here is a government that is all about these politicians and denying it away from people. As part of the social contract that people have agreed to give up some of their rights, the state has a correlative obligation to make sure that it looks after the welfare of the citizens. That is breached when the government does not really look after the altruistic interest of these people but use their plight. Second, we think that it creates a less objective critique of other people and other politicians because there's going to be less capital to invest in fact-finding investigations, use public and private funds for paper trailing, thorough investigation. Firstly, because it's time-consuming. Second, it's not as much of a spectacle. Like, for example, when the ombudsman sacked 6 COA officers, nobody really heard about it until people said that it was an act of demolition by the administration. Or, for example, Junjun Bina's case would not have been seen the way it would have been seen if the Binas were not saying that it's done by the government to demolish us. The point of it is that it weakens government institutions' credibility. Institutions like COA, the Ombudsman, PIR, or the courts, because these institutions are supposed to be seen as the first avenue to bring up these complaints, they become optional. And their function is only secondary to cross-check whether or not the person is lying. But even if that's the case, Mr. Speaker, we don't believe that the veracity of the critics can be verified. Firstly, because the damage is already been done. An image of a public person once tarnished may be irreversible even if you can prove that the person is not guilty. Case in point, if you try to look at the Visconde massacre, for example, even if the court have declared that they're not guilty, people feel the need for vindication because they feel that these individuals are guilty. But second, we think that this was done in bad faith. Because if you try to look at partisan politicking, it's not an accident. It's not a mere critique of an issue, Mr. Speaker. It's a calculated political move with desired effects. The first one is to tarnish the image of their political enemies, making their downfall an advantage. If they look bad, I look good. It's a zero-sum game. But second of all, it's a spectacle. It's an attention-grabbing opportunity for them that cuts down on investment on legitimate avenues which are costly, Mr. Speaker. The second thing is that for those people that are being attacked, it's an easy cop-out because there's less accountability on their part. Like, for example, for Rene, it's seen as a diversionary technique. Instead of him showing up in court and facing the trial, Mr. Speaker, what he does is that this is a demolition job of the government. In effect, that lessens the credibility of the critique because it diverts the attention to what the critique is about to making it look like it's an attempt, Mr. Speaker, for people to do that. The third one is that let's try to look at the political legacies that it's leaving. Firstly, politicians are no longer invested in making their platforms as best as it could. It's always contingent on how bad you can make the previous administration look. Mr. Speaker, this is bad. You're again betraying the people. You're betraying your potential. But finally, it lessens the innovation of new bills or new platforms that are directly beneficial to people. But it's not just the politicians, Mr. Speaker, that will be affected, the citizens themselves. Firstly, in terms of the quality of discourse, if you try to look at the people, they do not have any direct participation towards the politics and legislation after the election. It's their politicians that they voted into power that serve their interests supposedly. What happens is that they are betraying the interest of the public because they're no longer invested in making sure that they serve the interest of the public, but to make themselves look good. If you try to look at what's happening right now, Mr. Speaker, while people are critical, the extent of people's ability to be critical is limited. Those people that are directly in power are the ones that are supposed to do that and are the ones that are empowered to do that. They're not doing it. But secondly, the people's orientation is also shaped by their politics. If you try to look at people right now, the only time they speak up about their government is when they're able to find something that's faulty as well. Not when they're able to find something that's good, that's commendable about their government. It's also a bad orientation for people when they are built and molded by their government. But finally, it creates political gridlock. It allows people to oppose for opposition's sake, not already looking at the veracity of what their opponents are saying in Congress, but I'm going to oppose it because we're not from the same political party. If I support you, that's me backstabbing my political party. That's not good. I have to make sure that I attack you as a person, your credibility, and not what you're arguing, Mr. Speaker. All actions are viewed in bad faith. This is the kind of vicious culture that we are creating in our politics. That's why we're not progressing. Because politics is not just about having opposition, it's also about compromise. You lessen the ability of politicians to come up with a compromise because of this strategy. What have you taken from my speech? Several things. Firstly, in principle, I've proven that this is a betrayal of the people. This weakens government institutions. People are less objective. It's an easy cop-out for people like Binay and Alma Moreno. Citizens are... Sorry, I'm excited. Citizens are also being oriented to behave in that particular manner. And finally, it creates bad politics in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We now recognize the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when you try to analyze the contributions of open government, we think that their contributions belong on another debate. Because when you try to analyze that when their argumentations that it is morally wrong, it weakens the institutions, it weakens the quality of discourse, this exists in a debate as if we are trying to question or hate, whether or not we should allow or we should regret hate statements in the national government, Mr. Speaker, with no specific nuance of these particular occurrences in cases when there are tragedies. But regardless, let's try to extend to their particular frame. Because according to them, the largest contribution from open government is the idea that, you know what, this is morally wrong. And that this actually tries to distort the quality of discourse, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. But again, as soon as leader of the opposition, we think that we have responded quite adequately on that particular respect. Because you have to realize that the beauty of democracy is that you can essentially have access to information. So in cases of tragedies, when people actually make false claims and attributes a particular fault to another particular party, that these particular news institutions, media, and various sectors are all the more incentivized to actually look into the veracity of that, considering that tragedies become of national interest and of national importance, Mr. Speaker. That is why when we actually reported on the death of the staff, Mr. Speaker, members of this House, and actually Noy tried to wash his hands and actually attribute that fault to another official, it becomes easier for various sectors to actually debunk that. Because this becomes a national interest, it incentivizes various sectors to actually look into the veracity of these particular institution statements regarding that particular issue. Therefore, the bottom line is that the kind of fears that open of government actually has with regard in the dangers that they actually proposed is something that is already being answered in the status quo, considering that they essentially nuance this debate that occurs in democracies, Mr. Speaker, where there is free access of information, right? So we don't really understand you. Later, there's also this idea that, you know what, it becomes an insult to various institutions like COA and the courts. That's not true. You have to realize that these particular institutions are public institutions in the first place. It means them being public institutions, they easily become accountable for their actions because they know that most of the time, a lot of people, the public, are going to actually look into their particular actions, the kind of judgments that they have to take over important particular issues. Mr. Speaker, members of this House. Therefore, the kind of idea that this weakens quality of discourse, this weakens institutions and the quality of their judgments is something that is essentially resolved under our model. Sit down. I have one argument for you, but I'll be dividing this discussion on two sub-prongs. The only contribution from Deputy Leader of the Opposition is that we are going to look into the psyche of victims when these tragedies happen. We have to realize, Mr. Speaker, that tragedies cause so much emotional trauma upon victims whenever they experience wars, whenever they experience flash floods, whenever they have their homes destroyed, whenever they have their husbands killed because of the murder and massacre of SAP, Mr. Speaker, members of this House. What is the point? We think that in these particular instances, in these particular cases, the judgments of victims are clouded. They easily get so confused, emotionally distressed. They easily get so paranoid because they hang on to the hopes to profound chances. In these moments, they get lost, they get troubled about having to live another day with our loved one that is lost. First prong, we think that to a certain extent, we argue that there is value in politicking in these particular instances. Because in analyzing the rhetoric of politicking, these are emotionally charged tools. Like a relief good from Diliman may indicate that there is hope amidst all these problems, but we could achieve a brighter tomorrow if you have Diliman as president, Mr. Speaker. We think that the use of strong emotions only exists when there is politicking, because that's what political propaganda is all about, right? Appeal to emotions, appeal to people's minds, hearts, and interests. But the point is, Mr. Speaker, sometimes you need a strong statement through politicking to give people hope, to essentially convince them that they can rise again. You're more likely to inspire more people if these particular propaganda are actually appealing more and more to emotions, Mr. Speaker, especially when hope is the only thing that they have to hang on at that particular instance. Unlike in their model, Mr. Speaker, where politicking is disallowed and where you're only permitted to extend relief efforts to the strictest sense, we think that it becomes less likely, Mr. Speaker, to inspire people to rise again and to live another day, because you don't essentially add another sentimental value to that particular action of extending a relief goods that ultimately attributes as an effort of Pinay, right? even if, sit down, to certain political even if certain political parties can claim false statements, so what? Kurt already mentioned the nature of tragedies. These are of wider national importance. So if claims can be so if a particular politician will attribute a fault to another politician, these claims can be easily examined. You have existing sectors who are all the more incentivized to examine these claims, right? And what is worse is that the more exaggerated their claims are, the more it hurts for them because information is basically accessible. So if these particular sectors have been able to find out that these particular claims are exaggerated in the first place, it will necessarily affect their credibility in making those statements, Mr. Speaker. So at that particular instance, it becomes less likely essentially for these institutions to actually make false claims that easily. Yes.
It is your burden to prove why it's okay to use these tragedies to advance your political cause. Because right now you're just talking that this politicking will resolve or answer the issue, but not advancing of the cause.
Second prong of argumentation. We think that politicking has a value in correcting irrational ideologies because we have to realize the nuance of tragedies. In tragedies, you see a lot of parties that encroach the vulnerable minds of victims, and this is dangerous because there's more likely for you to create more enemies of the state. For example, during the Zamboanga siege, regardless of the government's efforts to extend help to people, there's some people who owed allegiance. There are some evacuees who owed allegiance to the MNLF because they essentially felt that they were abandoned by the government, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. To a certain extent, we think that politicking sometimes corrects these particular harms because to a certain extent, Mr. Speaker, it gives an avenue for people that they can easily directly attribute that kind of help to another particular politician, Mr. Speaker, members of this House. Therefore, conversely, it becomes less likely for these individuals to essentially make particular choices that may contradict the interests of those particular individuals because it becomes a harder decision, especially when they feel that the government never abandoned us, that this government has become nicer to us. With all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Ops. That concludes the opening half of this debate. To begin the closing half, we welcome the members of government.
The hard extension coming from closing government is going to be all about how the narrative of partisan politicking, ladies and gentlemen, skews the discourse, formulating absurd policies, for example, without having any proper assessments at all. But before the substantives, ladies and gentlemen, let's just spawn the cases coming from opening opposition. Let's start first with the first level of rebuttal. Because according to them, society has a self-corrective mechanism. People will verify and counter it. I have two responses. Number one, this logic only applies under the idea of individuals searching for the truth, and that, ladies and gentlemen, and that is not the debate. And we think up until now, opening opposition is dismissive to the worst-case scenario of government bench, ladies and gentlemen. But even if society has a self-corrective mechanism, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to flip the argument. We think this is even much more necessarily harmful because even under the best-case scenario of opposition, ladies and gentlemen, because we have to realize who are these individuals who practice partisan politicking, ladies and gentlemen. These are high-profile people who have a massive influence to the extent they can be really reliable as an authoritative figure that can magically solve the problem. People will be lured still to believe them without checking the pros and cons of those policies anyway. But a second rebuttal I want to launch is this. This is to targetively solve the case coming from Deputy Leader of Opposition. Because according to him, in this particular instance, you're able to analyze the psyche of individuals. You even encourage other individuals to join the food team in the Zamboanga siege, for example. I don't think this is the case, ladies and gentlemen, because these kinds of things are for humanitarian causes, and this is an absolute isolated case, because this example only proves that it doesn't have any political agenda or values at all. But a hard extension coming from closing government is where the closing opposition should respond to, on how the narrative of partisan politicking screws the discourse in formulating absurd laws without having any proper assessments about it. Because this is where we have to talk about the act of our partisan politicking on the grounds of its discourse nature and analyze if this really focuses the problem on the spotlight being conversed at that. Because when opening government talked about the idea of perceptive harms only, what we're going to come to closing opposition is give you the harms and ground it in an extent of reality and consequences of it at the end of the day. Because with partisan politicking, ladies and gentlemen, it's not just all about pitching themselves to be believed by the people, but it also extends to the skewing of the people's interests to lure them in a narrative to support them at that. Only Republican and democratic values, ladies and gentlemen. We think and we see coming from closing government, this is harmful because you don't give enough objective material for individuals to assess their decision. You're using an emotion to flip their mindset from saying yes, from saying no to yes to your policies, for example, ladies and gentlemen. These are the promised tangible harms coming from closing government and the extent of its realistic consequences. This is the first example on the scenario of Paris attacks, ladies and gentlemen. Because Donald Trump's Republican Party used the scenario for partisan politicking at that by saying and endorsing themselves through advertising that those individuals should have guns personal to them, ladies and gentlemen, to defend themselves when terrorists attack. And we say this is harmful because the nuance is you can't defend yourself from those perpetrators when they are suicide bombers who can just drop their bombs anywhere at that, ladies and gentlemen, anywhere they want. And how do you expect individuals to defend themselves within these extreme situations? On a first level, you're already skewing the discourse, you're already skewing the minds of these particular individuals, and this is the closing opposition, this is the worst case scenario, closing opposition or even opposition bench should respond to. We think people would be incentivized to support them, to call for policies to be enacted, ladies and gentlemen, at that, because they will now change their perceptions about gun laws. This is even worse, ladies and gentlemen. Because coming from closing government with this, you allow absurd gun policies which can lead to shootings or mass shootings or illegal smuggle of guns. Now this policy even has a lesser regulation of these guns at the end of the day. But the second thing I want to settle is this. Also in the idea of Ben Carson, ladies and gentlemen, he is a retired neurosurgeon at that, ladies and gentlemen. He used the narrative of Muslims as dogs or even rabid killers, ladies and gentlemen, terrorists who are specifically refugees who need basic human rights and have their human dignity and human life be exercised at the end of the day. But what he wanted under his narrative, ladies and gentlemen, notes it down. What he wants is to have stricter immigration laws, which can lessen the number of refugee influx in those countries, for example. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is discriminatory for those individuals who are just victims or circumstances, ladies and gentlemen. But the ultimate harm under model within the scenario, ladies and gentlemen, of using partisan politicking is that you develop a much more toxic xenophobia. No individuals will think that these refugees are really a threat to their security. But before I proceed, sure.
But isn't it you are in a democracy where ideas are being tested and validated and subject to discourse? Why are these particular harms something that will most likely occur considering that these are self-correcting as based in the status quo?
We have told you from the onset the nature of partisan politicking, ladies and gentlemen. And this is the burden of opposition to respond to the worst case scenario of closing government, ladies and gentlemen. We think that doesn't even merit their case. But the third thing I want to say is this, or on the typhoons and tragedies, for example, ladies and gentlemen. When relief wood plastics are printed with the names of politicians, with the name of those party names for the nearing elections, which strips, ladies and gentlemen, the moral compass of individuals to vote for them because without these goods, they won't survive. And who took them out of that kind of hell, ladies and gentlemen? What this extension tells us at the end of the day, this tells us two things, Mr. Chair. From opening government, it talks about the perceptive harms, but coming from closing government, we have told you that with the diverting of the problem to benefit themselves, they have really tendency to forget the issue that should be discussed with targeted solutions, and it even resulted to absurd policies, for example. But secondly, we have told you explicitly that in this particular instance, with the idea of partisan politicking, you really develop or commodify you commodify the lives lost and victims of that, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that this is necessarily harmful if you want to protect them to begin with. But in the first place, you're going to ridicule them and have their votes be given to you. Conclusive government, we talked about the idea of the harms and the tangible harms and the extent of its realistic consequences, ladies and gentlemen. And we think this is much more important. Which is much more important than opening government, because only under a model, when we're able to prevent these kinds of things, we're also able to take out the partisan politicking at that. We're extremely proud to propose and extend. We think, ladies and gentlemen, and the new generation of the debating community should have a chance to take this championship. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, member of government. We now welcome the member of opposition.
I think the new generation should leave. The older generation should now take the debate, ladies and gentlemen. The debate is about democracy. In democracy, it is the ability of people to speak, to respond, to convince, or to correct what they think is wrong, ladies and gentlemen. It allows people to talk or to discourse and to debate. And in a democracy, it is prohibited. It is not prohibited for people to defend themselves. According to these people, in a democracy, sometimes you are not allowed to defend yourself. Or even if you are given the ability to defend yourself, it's still wrong. That's why it's regrettable for people to have that right to express, ladies and gentlemen. We think that that is wrong. We think that in a democracy wherein there are so many self-correcting mechanisms in terms of expression, we don't think that the harms that they told us will ever fly in this debate. I'm going to talk about three things in this debate. First, we think that these tragedies are opportunities to forward other legitimate causes. Number two, I'm going to talk about the idea that it ends the culture of apathy. Because sometimes we don't know that things are happening in the world, but then again, if it happens in our backyard, then we stand and say that's wrong. And I think it ends the culture of apathy if we politicize or if we use politicking in this kind of tragedy. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the discourse because apparently that is what discussed by our opponent. But let me discuss the rebuttals first. They say that we have an uncritical. Okay, sorry. They say that they have an uncritical mass. We say that this is wrong. How? Because in the present, you can file libel cases. The media is actually creating investigative reports over politicians' cases, ladies and gentlemen. And let's talk about social media, wherein millions and millions of people are logged in every day to fact check the things, the statements that are done by the politicians, ladies and gentlemen. And also, these politicians can defend themselves. Binay filed so many libel cases over news reports. Moreover, we say that we now have an audience that is as critical as it is, ladies and gentlemen, and as vibrant. Let's talk about radio hosts that talks about these issues every day, ladies and gentlemen, that invites parties, ladies and gentlemen, to defend their policies, ladies and gentlemen, or to their support to these politicians, ladies and gentlemen. The question is, the idea that the democracy or the audience that receives these messages are uncritical is not proved by this team, ladies and gentlemen. Second, sit down. It weakens the agencies that people can run to. I don't think so. You can always go to court. You can always clean your name. Third, you can always defend yourself in public too, using the same tool as your opponents did, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about Villar. Villar now is very, very mabango, ladies and gentlemen, after the election because he was able to defend himself. Best CEO in Asia, created the first mall in Zambo, ladies and gentlemen. So that is really good and was able to retain that kind of prestige that he has sit down in the get-go, ladies and gentlemen. Now let's talk about the case of the closing opposition government. That emotion can flip, that their emotion can flip their decisions, ladies and gentlemen. The more reason why we should politicize or we should use partisan politicking in these tragedies in order to not make these victims or these tragedies to unilaterally decide on the next actions that they do, ladies and gentlemen. More people should talk, more people should start politicking, ladies and gentlemen, in order to create more discourse, ladies and gentlemen. I have no time. Sit down. First case. Let's say that we say that it is an opportunity to forward other causes. Tragedies invites audience, more eyes, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, for legitimate causes to prosper, it should use these tragedies, ladies and gentlemen, to inform and educate more audiences, ladies and gentlemen, and to know the effects of these kind of tragedies. For example, the Paris attacks. You can't just pray for Paris when Beirut, Lebanon, and Syria are dying as well, ladies and gentlemen. You can't just cry for Paris, ladies and gentlemen. You have to open the eyes of so many people that there are other attacks happening all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. And don't cry just for Paris, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about the Lumans. Let's make it local because they made it local. There are so many sympathies that they are being massacred, killed, ladies and gentlemen. But at the same time, millions of Filipinos are actually denying the history of Bangsamoro people who were once killed and massacred in the past, ladies and gentlemen. So, the partisan politicking there of Bangsamoro people is to use the Lumad sympathies, ladies and gentlemen, to produce an eye-opener that, hey, you are hypocrite. Hey, you are using double standards, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this is an opportunity for them to open their eyes to their double standards and hypocrisy. Your point.
We never told you that they cannot politicize. They can base that on their platforms, create laws, create policies. But why use tragedy to forward that?
I just said, it has more audience. So meaning, my legitimate audience can reach more people, ladies and gentlemen, which I can use. Lastly, let's talk about Sindong and Yolanda. It exposed how incompetent our mayor in CDO, ladies and gentlemen, which lost the election. It was used by his opponents and was never able to recover from that because he has nothing really to show how competent he was, ladies and gentlemen. And that's a good thing in toppling a bad leader. Secondly, is it ends the culture of apathy, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, we are not alone. There are so many people living in this world being attacked by ISIS, ladies and gentlemen. So don't just cry in your home. Secondly, we say that the culture of apathy is now taken out, ladies and gentlemen, because there are so many people intervening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk. What if there is ignorance, ladies and gentlemen? Let's talk about 9/11. After the 9/11, we destroyed 2 countries, ladies and gentlemen, and there was no other party, ladies and gentlemen, that was able to correct the United States that you shouldn't do that because we will bear and suffer from that consequence, ladies and gentlemen, of so many terrorism in the future if you do that. If the people are not apathetic, because if the tragedy of 9/11 was used by other activists, ladies and gentlemen, to open the eyes against wars in the world, ladies and gentlemen, then we could have prevented more tragedies in the future, ladies and gentlemen. Because, you know, we are not alone. If you attack another country, you will suffer. Lastly, we think that discourse is at its greatest during tragedies, ladies and gentlemen. Because discourse is valuable, because it ends as a compromise, wherein rights are respected in the get-go, ladies and gentlemen. When emotions are high, unilateral decisions are done, like attacking Iraq and Afghanistan. We think that we should prevent this kind of unilateral acts by partisan politicking when tragedies happen. By that, we proudly oppose.
Thank you, Member Fox. We now call on the government whip.
Government Whip has 2 issues to answer in this debate. Number 1, is this partisan politicking after tragedies even legitimate? And second, will the harms of this partisan politicking actually outweigh the benefit? But before that, a couple of responses to the opposition bench. We don't believe it is genuine benevolence of people that we simply rely on. But in government's model, we change people's perception that this is the responsibility of the government in times of tragedies to help the people. That tells the people in the government that we shouldn't be taking these politicians and voting them just because they helped us, because it is their job to do that. We don't understand Kelvin's point of saying that politicking will make people see that their government has not abandoned them because they will directly attribute it to a certain person or party because there are stickers, banners, or etc. placed on these relief goods. Government could just make people see that we have not abandoned them by giving relief donations without stickers or giving relief goods with stickers saying that this is from the government of Zamboanga or from the government of Davao and what have you. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that without you politicking in terms of tragedies. Sure, in an ideal world, ideas should be ideally tested and validated in a democracy. But we have to understand in this context that the ideas forwarded by these politicians coming from certain parties, which are even dumb and stupid and are sometimes totally unrelated to certain issues and the certain tragedies are regrettable because especially in the context of these tragedies, when people's emotions are uncontrollable and volatile and people are distraught and these politicians are seen as respectable figures, people are more likely, or the propensity of the people getting swayed to a skewed narrative or believing this politician is so likely. Because it's not a policy debate of these people legally allowed to do this, but we believe that this should be regretted, especially in a democracy when it skews the value or the quality of discourse happening. But on to the first issue. Is this partisan politicking after tragedies even legitimate? Because coming from government, we don't think it is legitimate. Because number one, it is illegitimate because sometimes it is even spurious or false. Second, it is morally abhorrent. Sometimes they don't even have evidence to prove that these certain issues or these certain statements or these certain things are attributable or correlational or causational to these kinds of tragedies. Moreover, they commodify the lives lost, the suffering of all these individuals. You say that this victim's family suffering could and should be utilized just to forward your personal agenda or your certain policies. This is akin to slum tourism wherein you use the poverty and suffering of poor people just to gain entertainment. But here, you just use their suffering to forward your own interests or your own agenda. And we believe that this is morally apprehensible. Especially that these people have been suffering, these people have lost their family. But before I go on to my second issue, okay, Kelvin.
But the thing is, under tragedies, it is a matter of urgent need. At this particular instance, sometimes politicking becomes the largest incentive for individuals to actually extend help and actually resolve issues in tragedies in the first place.
In your world where politicking is very popular and is present, this is the mindset of politicians and their only incentive. But we believe that in a world where politicking is not apparent, wherein politicians or government officials are just incentivized to help because they believe that this is their responsibility, or they believe that this will make the people see that they are responsible, it's a much more better world. But on to the second issue. Do the harms of politicking actually outweigh the benefit? Because opposition told us that there are self-correcting mechanisms in society that has come from ELO, especially in a democracy. But we have to discuss the spectrum of people. There are people who are critical, who want to search and are very curious about these certain issues or certain tragedies. But there are people who are uninformed or even uncritical, the masses. Most often than not, the uncritical and uninformed mass, when they hear a political figure or someone say something because they see that the politician is respectable, they immediately believe that or stick with that first information. It is only those critical people who are incentivized to even search or question these kinds of things. So meaning counter-information or narrative are not that effective in this case. This is very harmful because when people's perception change and get influenced by politicking during these tragedies or politicking statements or deeds, this translates to people even voting for these politicians in the next elections. Politicians who aren't really genuine, politicians who use taxpayers' money to give relief goods and claim that it is theirs and it is through their benevolence, politicians are most likely corrupt. And how does this even translate in a country? This translates to even more corruption in the future, or more skewed policies that only benefit the politician himself and not the people or the taxpayers. Furthermore, when people get swayed by this politicking and support these statements, like for example, the example we've given you in Donald Trump, who said that Paris attacks worsening are because of stricter regulations in Paris. If people believe that the Paris attack was worsened because people didn't have guns to defend themselves, and when people support this, it will be disastrous. What happens when people support less stricter gun laws or regulations? It might even translate to more shootings because now bad guys could just easily get guns. Or if people believe Ben Carson's statement against the Paris tragedy brought about by refugees will more likely be turned back to their horrible governments, and these refugees would most likely lose their lives. These people forwarding Republican values and policies after tragedies, we believe this is very regrettable because it skews the discourse, and it even goes to the extent of implementing this absurd and this skewed policies that actually translate into more harms for the people. And with all these reasons, we believe that this is the government win with CG. Can you maybe second or
Thank you, Government Whip. Finally conclude this debate. We welcome the authors.
When you are a victim of a tragedy, Mr. Chair, your only aim here is for your voice to be heard by the greater populace, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. For the government to hear your voice and for them to be able to listen your problem, especially when these particular matters are not even addressed in the very first place, when these particular matters are not even discussed by society, and society is not even informed that these problems do exist in the very first place. That is why, as a victim of tragedy, I would rather opt into politicians who are high profile at the end of the day, who's going to forward their agenda by using this particular tragedies. Because on the very least, I won't care at all. The matter here, which is very important, is for our particular concerns to be heard at the end of the day, to instill discourse, to kill the culture of apathy, and then again, to forward other issues, and to tell the rest of the world that, well, we have our voices needed to be heard at the end of the day, Mr. Chair and member of this House. Because what usually happens in this debate is just to try to criticize entirely about maybe the partisan politicking in its very worst case scenario without even debating what could be the possible benefits even at the worst case scenario, Mr. Chair and member of this House. Because OG tried to told us that for you to be able to say something, the manner should be considered at the end of the day, Mr. Chair. That you're even creating an uncritical mess that even in BI's case, there's no accountability at all. People don't know who is really accountable at the end of the day. But for that particular case to fly in this debate, you should be able to provide the particular link as to why the greater populace is not even rational or irrational at the end of the day. That they're already the uncritical people, that they're in the unreactive people, Mr. Chair. That by this case, it won't create any discussion. Because by the way, debating in the real context, we think that the citizens at most are already informed. They have already discussions on social media. Like for example, if you're against this particular individual, or if you're for this individual. At the end of the day, Mr. Chair, what is very important here is that discussions are even balanced at the end of the day. It doesn't homogenize the entire particular discussion sphere, Mr. Chair. Because assuming that we're going to debate under worst case scenario, even coming from Arnold, that well, the particular method of inquiry here is very good to court trials, Mr. Mr. Chair, it's even fashioned in a very elitist way and even in a method where people or individual cannot be able to access for a particular discussion. They can no longer intervene here because somehow some of the greater populace who are not involved in social media doesn't understand this facts, right? Because, well, you simply need to understand that greater populace would respond to these particular issues if these issues are relayed on a very layman's term at the end of the day, Mr. Chair. Even using the very extension of Z, that when we discussed that it ends the culture of apathy, and even using tragedies to be the jumpstart of inspiring inspiring discourse at the end of the day, Mr. Chair. Because tragedies in itself is controversial, right? Because these particular tragedies are even the talk about in the society. What is the nuisance here when it comes to the partisan politics? Because the partisan politics, the moment that these tragedies are going to enter here, everyone discusses it. It becomes controversial to the sense where every individual, every citizen are going to participate on it at the end of the day, Mr. Chair. Well, here, discourse acts the greatest during tragedies' death. Because if we're going to see even the staff or the PBL in itself, Mr. Chair, individuals were able to react the moment that, well, Binay or even Aquino was even brought into this book. Mr. Chair, member of his doubts. You can even exploit the particular identity of those high-profile, Mr. Chair, that, well, you can even forward this idea. But furthermore, Mr. Chair, we think that it's very essential for us then to talk about these particular tragedies at the end of the day when you're going to nuance into the partisan politics then. We think that, well, if you're able to want to draw to the context that, well, we should be able to have this particular manner at the end of the day, you need to provide to the link of how you're going to access the greater society, which we think that Z was so important here. But furthermore, DPM sit down. DPM even talk about, well, we wanted to have to discuss more about the critic and not on the people at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, because it's the only time when you talk about them is because during elections. But on the very least, these matters are even discussed, right? Because somehow, Mr. Chair, on the regular discussions, these things aren't even brought up in the first place. It's very false for you to assume that, well, if you're going to debate on a utopian manner, then what is going to exist then, right? But, well, then, Mr. Chair, we think that, well, at the end of the day, at its best, the PBL, the South issues are going to be addressed by the clamor of the greater demands of the society. But furthermore, they talk about, well, there's going to be a less practical fundings, right? Because of these individuals. Because we think it's false, because even from both parties, they'll try to represent various evidences on the fact that they want to push their claims at the end of the day, Mr. Chair. But when they talk about the tarnish of COA administration, okay, before 6, Arnold.
We became aware that the SAF issue happened because of the news, and there's a standard liability to inquire to it. But why is it okay for certain politicians to use this to advance certain policies, just anti-Bangsamoro? A lot of people are now anti-Bangsamoro because of the SAF incident.
We don't care about the particular method, Mr. Chair, because at the very least, there's a particular solution that these politicians are even trying to propose. In contrast to your paradigm, we don't know how these particular issues are going to be addressed, right? At the very least, politicians are going to compete at which best fashion or which particular best method are we going to solve the problem. But moreover, we think that even the tarnish in the COA administration will push the government to act on it, to resolve the issues in the branch of the government. This creates an incentive to the government to address the two and to hear the voice of the people more. But moreover, we talk about the case coming from a member of government. We're told that it is very wrong to use the emotions of people. But we think it is very important that why is this a case? Because when emotions are high, when we do not intervene, it creates a unilateral decision which is dangerous and things that are damaging happening. Because if we're going to have an homogeneous discussion as to how we're going to solve the Paris attacks at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, without any sense coming from the other side, it's not going to question the act of bombing that has killed many civilians. The act of bombing that is not even targeted to the problem in the first place, just destroying Raqqa to begin with, right? We think, Mr. Chair, that the moment that you're going to use this particular political partisan politicking, Mr. Chair, is the moment you're going to flare up the emotions of the public. But you need to respond to these particular issues at the end of the day. So what your problem previously coming from closing opposition is that somehow, even as a dirty tactic at the end of the day, or the very least repercussions are going to be flared up. Even if it's dirty tactic, at the end of the day, at least there's going to be a particular set of solutions in how we're going to solve it. For all these reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thanks.
Paano nag-loop yung paulit-ulit na? Ano yung NCW? Paano loop.
Camera, pati okay.